Eric Miller is an international trade advisor with the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group. We've reached him in Washington. Mr. Miller, thanks for joining us. You've had a chance to look at this new U.S., Canada, Mexico trade agreement and this clause dealing with future trade deals with countries that have non-market economies. What do you make of that?
Well, certainly what you're seeing is that the United States is in essence trying to ensure that China does not have a free trade agreement with either country on its border. You see right now the situation between the United States and China worsening substantially. In essence, you're seeing in some views in Washington a shift of China from being a rival to indeed an enemy. And that's certainly something that is not a universally shared view. But the fact that the Trump administration has moved very aggressively on putting $250 billion in tariffs on China, the fact that they've made very clear statements on the views of recognizing Taiwan versus China in the case of El Salvador, the United States is certainly stepping up its focus on trying to ensure that that its hemisphere, as it sees it, is one in which China has a reduced influence rather than expanded influence. And certainly this played into the North American Free Trade Agreement and was undoubtedly inspired by the Trudeau government's outreach to Beijing around a possible free trade negotiation last December.
All right. So what effect do you think, as you say, the Trudeau government's talked about broadening and diversifying its trade agreements and talked about China as well. What effect could this have on Canada's future trade plans? What's the message here from the United States?
Well, certainly in the case of Canada, what you're seeing is a certain constraining of options. And some have suggested that perhaps Canada should not have signed on to this. But there's an old saying that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. And certainly any trade agreement with China was well far off in the future, well after the Trump administration would be gone from office. And so in essence, the Trudeau government wanted to lock in and secure present access to the U.S. as compared to possible future access from China.
Canada's foreign affairs minister is downplaying that clause, saying, look, NAFTA has an opt-out clause now with 6 months notice. So why is this different? What's basically, why me worry? Don't worry about this.
So, sorry, you just cut out briefly there. So you're asking why is the non-market economy piece, in particular the removal from Canada, the removal of a country that signs with a non-market economy, how is that different? Is that what you're asking, Peter?
Yeah, well, basically our foreign affairs minister here says that there's an opt-out clause, a 6 months notice opt-out clause in NAFTA now. Why is this different?
Well, certainly in the case of the non-market economy, you would be looking at a very clear statement that you have to notify of an intent to negotiate with a non-market economy. You have to give notice before you sign, and that each country reserves the right to remove a country that has signed an agreement with a non-market economy. In essence, it is less of the opt-out clause as it's more of the boot-out clause. And so what it's effectively doing is saying, we know, Canada, that you're not likely to choose China over the United States, since 70% of your trade goes to the United States. You have the right to go and do that if you choose to do so, but we also reserve the right to ensure that you are not part of the North American framework under the USMCA. And so what that effectively does is it suggests that Canada will not, in fact, move to negotiate a free trade agreement with China. And, of course, there's implications for trade diversification. But I've argued for a while that Canada is not ready, in fact, to negotiate a free trade agreement with China. So the practical effect is trading a theoretical agreement in the future with a very real agreement in the present.
All right. Why do you say Canada's not ready?
The reason they're not ready is because we do not know enough about how the Chinese economy works. I read a piece in the Globe and Mail 2 years ago in which I recommended the creation of a tiger team that would bring the best and brightest across government. And what they would do first and foremost is spend 18 months in China figuring out how the Chinese economy works, figuring out how the money flows, how the subsidies work to provincial governments. How does China actually operate its trading system? How are multinationals treated in China for the purposes of investment and dispute resolution? China is unlike any other country in the world. And what I worry is that Canada does not know enough about how China works in order to effectively negotiate disciplines on market access, on investment, on services, and all of the other important areas of trade negotiations. And so my suggestion is to take a step back and take a serious look at what China is, much like the McDonald Commission did in effect on the United States before the negotiation of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. It's not that one should say no to an agreement with China in the future, but certainly one should take one's time. Because as you've seen in cases like Australia, even free trade agreements do not guarantee market access. In the case of Australian coal, when market conditions changed, the Chinese used non-tariff measures to keep them out of the market. But you can bet your bottom dollar that Canada would not be able to get away with that trick, and that the Chinese would always demand full access, even if conditions in our industries change.
Okay, let's finish on this. Notwithstanding the suggestion that a possible trade deal with China may be a long way off, do you think the United States would pull out of the deal it negotiated with Canada if Canada negotiates a deal with China?
I think that it wouldn't get that far. In essence, this is about constraining future policy choices. The Trudeau government anyway was not looking to negotiate a free trade agreement before the next election. They were certainly taking a look at their China policy. Indeed, I spoke with a senior official on the political side recently who told me that they felt that Canada needed an Asia strategy more broadly, because certainly after the Prime Minister's visit to India, after the Prime Minister's visit to the APEC summit in Vietnam, there was a sense that Canada was not doing as well as it needed to be doing on the Asia front. And so I hold that fundamentally what this government and the next government need to do is to first take a step back and figure out how to take advantage of the world's fastest growing region rather than rushing headlong into doing free trade agreements. Certainly you're seeing the option to do a free trade agreement with China constrained, but one thing we do know is that Donald Trump will not be president forever, and it may be that a future U.S. administration will want to look at a different relationship with China. And so this is a question of how things look in the future. But certainly what you're seeing now is that the relations between the U.S. and China are getting worse. And in essence, the U.S. is looking to have its allies firmly in its camp in what could, I hate to say it, be a new Cold War.
All right, Eric Miller, appreciate your perspective joining us from Washington today. Thanks for your time, sir.
Thank you. Take care.